And this is, as you can see, the recording starts. So this is the second webinar, Trust in Media Telework During and After the COVID-19 Pandemic. So yesterday we had a very rich debate about the many impacts of telework during the pandemic on journalists. And we had heard the result of our survey that although telework has become the new norm for many journalists and many workers, the management and support of telework by media companies has been inadequate. It is nearly impossible also for many workers, especially female journalists, to maintain work-life balance. And journalist union and associations have been taking on the role of negotiating on behalf of journalists to guarantee their decent working conditions, access to information and equipment, etc., while conducting telework. So today's discussions, we're really focusing on these actions and good practices from unions and associations at both national and European level, and also beyond our sector, knowing that this is a main trend affecting all workers in cross-sector. So before I hand over to the moderator, Alan, I just want to do some advertisement. So this two-day webinar is part of the project funded by the European Commission and UNESCO and implemented by the European Federation of Journalists on trust in media. So Alan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I totally agree. We had some very constructive discussions yesterday. I learned a lot, and I hope the other attendees did the same. The discussion showed that there's a lot of benefits to hybrid and telework, but there's also a lot of challenges. And some of these challenges is necessary to do to cope with in solidarity and union, and that is why unions were invented in the first place, to solve these kind of problems. Today we will have 3 panelists, each delivering a short, around 10 minutes for us. And afterwards we will have the chance to ask questions and share our own good practices if we have any. I really hope that we can finish today and be wiser and get out there to do more good for our many members around Europe. The panel will be Pierre Berset-Guy from the European Trade Union Institute, a researcher there. It will be Naila Glaise from the Union Générale Ingénieurs, Cadres et Techniciens in France, and it will be Elias Shoshkun from TGS, the journalist union in Turkey. So I think we will start in the big picture, and it's you who knows a lot about different unions' perspectives, cross-sectorial challenges. Afterwards, Naila will tell us a little bit about how the engineers and technicians in France who have had telework as a part of their everyday life for many years, but of course really enforced during the pandemic, how they have worked with that, how they have made different company agreements and so forth. And Elias will tell us a bit about how Turkey has worked on the ground with the pandemic and telework as a way to get into companies and try to do new things. But I think we will start out with Pierre, who has a small presentation for us.
Sure, I will share my screen. Pop. 1 minute. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yes, it's very
good. Today I want to talk about guidelines for good practice, because like you said, we are in a particular time where telework is becoming mainstream, and also we need to move from a dysfunctional version of telework, which was the standard during the pandemic. So I will try to present some guideline from a scoping review we conducted at the E2I. But starting with a definition. One of the most widely used definition of telework is the following one. So the use of information and communication technologies for the purpose of working outside the employer's premises. But this is somewhat of a misleading definition, because telework is not only about technologies. It's not only about sending workers home with a laptop. It is obviously way more than that. Telework is a new way of organizing and performing work. And to be effective and sustainable for the workers, it implies a reorganization of work processes, a complete overhaul of work processes going beyond digital tools, beyond the introduction of digital tools, and touching upon every aspect of the work situation. And the pandemic made it very clear that this transformation cannot be done overnight. So this is a snapshot of some of the results of a global survey conducted by Eurofound during the first month of the pandemic. So when working from home was either compulsory or recommended. And as you can see, findings paint a bleak picture. The most commonly reported issue are related to inadequate equipment, lack of support from manager, decreased work productivity, overwork, work-life balance issue, difficulties to properly disconnect from work, and work-family conflicts. Of course, much of these challenges are coming from the fact that employers had very little time to adapt to telework. And also many employers had no prior experience of telework arrangements. But the risk we are facing today is that this model of remote working, which has proved to be dysfunctional, becomes widespread, because it is the sole point of reference of many employers. So the question is now how can we learn from this dysfunctional rollout of remote working and rethink telework, not as a temporary solution, but as a permanent and sustainable evolution of the way we work. And the key message is to move from a narrow definition of telework and rethink telework as a new way to manage work, an evolution of work practices. And this transition to structural telework require a holistic approach, touching upon four main aspects. Over the past 2 decades, a lot of research has been conducted on good practices related on each of these dimensions. Of course, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, but general guidelines that need to be adapted to the specificities of the sector, the specificities of the organization itself. So I will try to present a few of these general guidelines, but keeping in mind that it needs to be adapted, of course, to the sector. So when it comes to work organization, one of the main challenges is to build and maintain role clarity. It is more challenging for remote workers to have a clear understanding of the task, of their responsibilities, of the processes at work, especially for new recruits. So one of the challenges is to clearly define those tasks, those objectives, including which tasks to be performed remotely, individuals to report to, individuals to seek help from, and so on. Also, telework arrangement should involve flexibility in organizing working time and space. So it has been demonstrated that telework is leading to higher job satisfaction only when telework involves such flexibility. So one typical example is scheduling working time around personal responsibilities, for instance. So that's an example of flexibility afforded by telework. It's also important to set clear guidelines regarding communication methods, but not only for the sake of clarity, but also to prevent work-life balance issues. So this includes avoiding the duplication of communication channels, which is quite typical in telework. Also setting up expected response time that are realistic, and of course integrating the right to disconnect in the company policy. Another key factor to the success of telework is to find the right balance between autonomy and control. And this is probably the most tricky aspect of telework, because teleworkers should be given greater latitude in organizing their work, but they should still feel being supported by the organization. So there is no, again, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. This balance between autonomy and control will depend on the function of the sector. But in any case, organizations should refrain from using digital surveillance technologies, because it has been demonstrated that it leads to privacy issue, of course, but also to reduced trust levels within the company. So work relationships. Here, the main challenge is to avoid social isolation, of course. So to ensure that remote workers stay connected with other workers, connected with a supervisor, and with the organization as a whole. So with the organization, the organization should ensure that corporate information are properly disseminated to an hybrid workforce. So this is also a challenge when some workers are working from home, others in the company premises. No one should feel excluded. Everyone should be given information in a timely manner, especially information related to election of representatives, introduction of new tools, new processes, and so on. But communication should not be limited to content, and also include the social aspects of work. The idea is to recreate the workplace virtually, which is not an easy task, of course, but yeah, creating opportunities to connect outside of work obligation, like it's happening at the coffee machine in a company. And the most obvious example, I'm sure many of you experience that, or at least heard about it, is the virtual coffee corner, where a worker can socialize and exchange informally. So this is very important to maintain this type of opportunities. The employing organization should also promote a culture of trust and openness, as opposed to a culture of surveillance and suspicion. So again, research demonstrates that a trusting environment is the glue that holds every aspect of a telework policy together. So it's very central to job satisfaction in telework arrangement. And finally, managers should be proactive in encouraging open discussion about the hurdles the worker is facing on a case-by-case basis, and on solution to address them. Workload is another key issue for teleworkers. Teleworkers are twice as likely to exceed the 48 hours working time limit. So it's very important to specify clear and achievable objectives from the start, but most importantly, it's important to achieve consensus with the worker on the content and amount of work to be performed remotely. Workload and content should also be adapted, rebalanced when necessary, and attention should be paid at developing also a shared vision of who is doing what in the team, because one of the key issues also is the duplication of work. When everyone is working at home, this can lead to this kind of situation. So it's important to maintain a shared vision of who is doing what. And finally, managers should be trained on how to manage workers remotely, and the content of the training should go beyond digital tools and include management style, privacy issue, health and safety. And last aspect, health and safety. So it's always useful to recall that the employer has a legal duty to assess the risks, and not only the physical risks, but also the psychosocial risks associated with telework. It's also useful to recall that all workers should benefit from the same level of protection regardless of where they are working from. So the general principle of prevention apply, but they should be complemented by specific measures targeted at the risks of telework. So isolation, overconnection, presenteeism, for instance. And also providing all the necessary equipment to work from home. It's also always useful to recall that the ergonomic of home furniture is not suited for prolonged use. So it is the employer who has the responsibility to provide ergonomic furniture to the workers. And finally, the employing organization has a duty to raise employees' awareness on these risks and on good practice to address them. So last slide, I'm a little bit longer, sorry for that. Most importantly, employers should be aware that telework is a double-edged sword. It can lead to a reconciliation of work and family life, but it also can lead to blurred boundaries between the two. It can be rewarding, it can be fulfilling, but it also can be draining, it can be isolating. It can lead to more autonomy and flexibility, but it also can be experienced as a burden because of constant surveillance. It can lead to higher productivity, but also to longer hours and overwork. It can lead to higher morale, but also to stress and sleep deprivation. And finally, telework can be an opportunity for mutual trust between the employer and the employee, but it also can lead to resentment and feelings of injustice. And this entirely depends on how telework is implemented at the company level. Again, these few guidelines are not off-the-shelf solution. These are direction, things to take into consideration, but specific measure must be tailored to the specificities of the workplace. And also, again, worker participation is key for this because workers know best how to do their work. And so their input is of great value, obviously, to design these measures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre. That was very interesting. This last slide very clearly showed the double-edged sword that you talked about. Are there any questions on clarification on the facts we just saw? Otherwise, I will hand over the word to Naila, who might, I know she has some very large surveys of the members that might also enlighten us on some of these effects. Naila?
Yes, hello. Thank you, Alan, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting webinar. I would like to introduce myself. So I'm part of UGIC CGT, which is the professional and managerial part of CGT, a French trade union confederation. So we represent professionals and managers, but in a cross-sectoral way. So we're not focused only on journalists, but all the professions. So my presentation will concern, of course, all the sectors. So I have prepared also a small presentation, and I will try to stick to the 10 minutes. Don't worry, Alan. So while I'm trying to find it, I'll tell you. So my presentation will be 2 parts. The first one I will talk about the tools and materials that we developed in my trade union for to help our representatives at the workplace. All right, I'm trying to find this. So to help our trade unions, can you see my presentation? No?
I can't see it now.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I was saying the first part will be to help our trade unions to negotiate and also to deal with these issues at the workplace. And the second part will be a bit about a survey, but I will not be long about the survey because the results of our surveys is not very far from what we have seen yesterday. And Pierre also talked about some general info about this. Okay, so what I would like to say is telework for us is an option that will transform our way of work. So it's an option, but it's also an opportunity that is very much appreciated by especially professionals and managers. It's a marker for management. Pierre said just right now that telework is a new way to manage work. So management is a key issue in this new work organization. We have the aspiration for telework because time and newfound autonomy. But we also have to keep in mind that some employers' objectives were to have some productivity gains, which is known. It was around 20 and 35% in different studies, but with also cost reductions because changing in the workplace and getting rid of some square meters. So it's also a cost reduction for them. And it presents a challenge for us as trade unions. So as tools, we have developed a variety of tools, but of course there is not one size fits all, and our tools has to be adapted at the company level and the sectoral level. But I will give you an overview of what we developed. So there's this big campaign that is still running. You can have the website here. So can you still see the website? Yeah.
No, we don't see the website.
Okay, so I have to stop sharing and share again because it's easier to show you directly. Okay, here it is. So yes. This is our campaign, and you can see here, this is to help our trade unions at the workplace, our proposal objectives, but also here are our tools. So what you can see, first of all, is, when we want to start negotiating with the employer at the workplace, we have what we suggest to our representative is to have a consultation, the consultation of employees at the workplace of how they live with this new work organization, what are their demands, what are their difficulties. So what we developed is a kind of template of this consultation. So the trade union can download it and adapt it and then send it to their colleagues at the workplace and then start negotiating at least with some information coming from their colleagues. So this is the one. So it's a générateur d'enquête, which is, so it generates surveys, and these surveys are for their colleagues. So we thought that this is much that can help our representative, because many of them do not know how to generate a survey, how to ask, what questions to ask. So it's something that can be useful. So another thing that we developed is like FAQ, so frequently asked questions about the people's rights. So 10 questions that people always ask: do I have the right to telework? Does my employer has the right to not accept my demand? What about the fees, expenses, etc., etc. We also developed a template of an agreement that could be adapted at the workplace. So this is an agreement that people can download and adapt it. It concerns all the topics that are related to telework, like the management issues, training, the right to disconnect, health and safety. Oh my gosh, my connection is so slow. So all of this is in a template agreement, and then trade unionists, when they start negotiating, they can take it and either copy paste or adapt it. We have also a video tutorial to negotiate an agreement. So we have like 10 different videos on different topics of the agreement, like working time, fees, gender equality, organization of work and management. So they can just listen to these tutorial videos and before negotiating or working on the topic with their employer. And we have also a lot of flyers and reports that are done, but we also wrote some guides. This one is a bit old, but it's still relevant on how to negotiate on Telework. So mainly, all of these tools are to help our trade unions to negotiate. Oh, there's also a bank of agreements. So you can have all the agreements of whatever sector you want. So if you want the agreements that are signed in France for the journalist, you can just go to this bank of agreements and type, we want the journalist sector, and then you can have all the agreements that are already signed. Okay, it's all in French, sorry about this. So you need to DeepL them. Okay, so this is it for the tools. I'll go back to my presentation. Up. Okay, so now we did a survey in June. This survey was launched at the national level in France. It had 100 questions, and it was processed by statistician. So it's like recognized at national level. We received 15,000 responses with 10,000 free verbatims, and I can present quickly the results. But something is very important that we noticed is that employer strategy of presenting telework as a privilege to the employees. And this is something that is very common. So it's telework is very much appreciated by most of the employees, almost all of them. But in that way, the employer's strategy is showing that this is a privilege. So at the other side, they are removing all the associated rights that are linked normally to telework. And this is something very important because we all appreciate this time working from home and not having to commute, etc. But we still have to be aware of the risks, and we need the rights that are associated to telework. Otherwise, it's not gonna stay anymore something that is good for us. So what we noticed is mainly by professionals and managers is the fact that the telework is not voluntary. It doesn't have the voluntary aspect yet. Okay, we know that we have some restrictions due to COVID, but many of the colleagues would like to go back to their workplace at least a few days a week, and sometimes it's not possible. The number of days of telework per week was mandated on 42% of the respondents. So they have to, they cannot choose the number of days of telework. And 63 note that due to the pandemic, they wanted to telework. So we also noticed that we had an increased working time, and this is even more for professionals and managers. And I think Pierre talked about this risk, but it's also a reality. So the majority of respondents report an increase in working hours and workload. We have a work that has been intensified with a decrease in the number and length of breaks. The boundaries between work and personal life are becoming increasingly blurred. 2/3 of the respondents say that they receive requests during their periods of leave, and 10% of them receive these requests all the time. On the top of that, a large majority of employers have not put in place measures provided by the labor code in France, like, for instance, the right to disconnect and other stuff. The good thing, as we said, is that telework could allow us to have more autonomy at work. 71% of respondents say they have flexibility in their working hours, whereas only 1/3 are on a fixed term contract and can therefore gain better working time arrangement. Despite the increase in time, workload, and intensity, a majority of respondents said they were less tired than with in-person work, with 30% being more tired. We had asked these questions ask our respondent to rank themselves on the WHO's well-being scale with an overall average score of 57 out of 100. The respondents as a whole are not far from the threshold indicating reduced well-being. So this is something that is very important, because we realize that there's an impact on their health. A majority consider that telework has a negative impact on their physical activities, and they have musculoskeletal disorders, and nearly 1/3 experience migraines or eye strain, which is a very high score after only 1 year of teleworking. The reorganization of workplaces. So for more than half of the respondents, work is complicated by the disappearances of informal time with colleagues, and the majority feel that team spirit has deteriorated, as has the quality of meetings. 2/3 of respondents say they feel isolated, with 1/4 regularly feeling so. So 1 year after telework became widespread, less than 1/3 of employees say they have been trained on telework. But at the same time, we can see that there has been some reorganizations of the premises. So more than 1/3 of respondents say that they have moved to open space or flex office, which is considered negatively by the majority. So the question is that our employers could have time to reorganize premises and workplaces, but not to train our managers on these new work organizations. So managers are under high pressures, so they judge the impact of telework negatively in all categories, and in particular on their ability to monitor and supervise their teams, the dissemination of information, and regarding the team spirit. So the relationship with the colleagues is directly affected, and they didn't receive any training about the remote management. Now about the costs. So this is also one topic very important for all our colleagues. Okay, who has to pay for this? Who has to pay for that? And it is an obligation that is associated with this employee status, the payment of telework equipment and costs. But even though it's an obligation, a majority of respondents do not have an ergonomic chair. Only 40% had access to an adapted screen financed by the employer. And for 19% of them, telework has meant that the employer's contribution to the cost of the meals in the workplace was questioned. So they didn't have their meal vouchers again, anymore. Nearly 7 out of 10 say that their employer does not contribute even partially to the costs of telework. At the same time, 70% consider themselves more efficient, which confirms that there is some productivity gains that were generated by telework. The material costs, conditions of work remain complicated, with almost 1/3 of the employees, especially women, that do not have dedicated or isolated space for telework. And this was more for women than for men. Now, talking about gender equality, 8 out of 10 respondents said that they had experienced teleworking while looking after their children. And then at the same time, only 9% say that they have access to partial activity for childcare. And this is particularly annoying for women, who are 61% that say that they have had to take on this burden alone, compared to 31% of men. And there's one thing also I would like to add about telework is the problem of being a trade unionist and teleworking. So 50% of staff representatives say that they find it difficult to keep in touch with teleworking employees, and more than 1/3 say that their employer forbids them to send information by email to employees. So either they don't have their employees' emailing list, or they don't have the right to use the professional email to write to their employees. So only 52% of them say that their company has signed an agreement on telework, and more than 1/3 consider that their opinion has not been taken into account in the negotiation. This figure must be reduced, of course, because we have to consider that in our survey we have 15,000 responses, but not all of them had trade unions representatives at the workplace. So this is, I wanted to mention this as well. But of course, we know that telework is very much appreciated by all of us. 83% of respondents said they had a good experience of teleworking, and 98% say that they wish to continue to telework after the health crisis, but for a shorter period of time, mostly around half of their working week, with only 14% wishing to continue working full-time in telework. So now we can see the positive points, which are the elimination of commuting, better articulation of time, better concentration in work, especially if you work in open spaces, autonomy, and change of living environment. But there are also negative aspects: isolation, sedentary lifestyle, blurring of professional and personal life, and unsuitable material conditions. Voila, I tried to keep it quick. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer your questions if you have any.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, I think. I'm quite impressed by the website with all the guides and templates and so. What is your experience? Do the members use those templates, or do you have a big demand for them?
Yes, every time we do any webinar to at least talk about the issue and present these, we have like hundreds and hundreds of members that connect. We had a press release, a press conference 2 weeks ago on this survey result, and we had like I don't know, all the national press that was here. But our members are particularly interested in it because they all started negotiating or asked for negotiation on this topic at the workplace. And you know, when we ask for negotiation and start negotiating, we have so less time to be trained on the topic. So it was very useful for them to see that we have videos on specific topics of this, so they don't have to read like hundreds of pages. This consultation of employees at the workplace, we have 10,000 people that downloaded it. So we keep looking at the data of how many people used these tools, and yeah, it's growing. It's still useful because we know that they're still downloading and using it. So yeah, we have at least good I mean, people tell us that, yeah, it's very good, and they're happy to find this.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Next panelist is Ilyas, who will tell us a bit about how Turkey has worked with this pandemic and found a way to get into new companies and new employers. And yeah, Ilyas. We can't hear you.
Thank you, Ellen. I guess you are seeing my presentation now.
Yes.
Perfect. As you said, I would like to talk about the negative impacts of the pandemic and teleworking in Turkey on journalists. And also I would like to talk about union activities against these negative impacts. First of all, when we talk about changing and reminding issues, like in other countries, there are changing and reminding issues for journalists in Turkey during the pandemic. And they, of course, have influenced the policies of the union. One of them, I would like to share some of their important ones. One of them, according to the 2021 World Press Freedom Index, Turkey ranks 153rd among 183 countries. Considering the Global Rights Index, Turkey, unfortunately, has been among 10 worst countries for working people without interruption since 2016. In other words, unfortunately, Turkey has a good position in neither collective rights nor press freedom index compared to most European countries. The other point is about the number of journalists behind bars. While there were 135 journalists behind bars in April 2019, the number has dropped to 36 in September 2021. The follow-up number is one outstanding or good development for us. The other good news for journalists in Turkey, the increasing unionization rate. While the total unionization rate in the sector was only about 7% at the beginning of 2019, but the rate is now over 8%. In the Turkish media industry, teleworking has been distinguished as a solid, outstanding alternative to prevent coronavirus spread since March 2020. And before the pandemic broke out, TGS had only 7 collective bargaining agreements in the sector. These media outlets are Reuters News Agency, Evrensel Newspaper, 9 Eylül Newspaper, Gazete Duvar, Biyanet, Yön Radyo, and Refinitiv. Besides, the union has achieved to gain the majority in 7 new media outlets: BBC, AFP, and AP offices in Turkey, Cumhuriyet Newspaper, İz Gazete, Halk TV, and 9 Haber from August 2020 until May 2021. During this unionization campaign, the TGS has mobilized media workers against the negative impacts of the pandemic and teleworking. When we talk about the legal regulations in Turkey, the government AKP introduced a ban on the dismissal of employment contracts. However, the ban reserved an exemption. According to the legislation, employers had the right to immediately cancel contracts based on immoral, dishonorable, or malicious conduct, or other similar behaviors. Then employers in Turkey abused this exemption, namely Code 29. According to the Social Security Institution in Turkey, an average of 491 workers were dismissed every day, despite the layoff ban in Turkey. Even though critics have continued, a new amendment was made in the controversial, namely Code 29 in labor law in April 2021. In addition to the termination ban, the government, AKP, implemented a unilateral unpaid leave until June 2021. According to the regulation, employers had the right to leave their workers entirely or partially on unpaid leave. Then the ruling party also introduced a short-time working allowance from March 2020 until March 2021. Allowance was submitted with the claim of protecting employees who work in companies that had suspended or decreased operations due to the pandemic. Within the scope of allowance, employers should reduce their weekly working hours by at least 1/3. In other words, from 45 hours to 30 hours a week. And while the applicant was only paid 60% of his or her monthly gross salary by the Social Security institution, the rest of the salary was paid by the employer. And the government made a teleworking bylaw in March 2021 within the scope of labor law. According to the bylaw, employers must sign a contract with their remote workers, and the contract agreement must include details such as the definition of work. Bylaw bans any discrimination against remote workers for the nature of their employment contracts. And the employers shall provide information and training to remote workers. Finally, employers are obligated to inform remote workers and provide training about occupational health and safety precautions. We need to say that, of course, the bylaw is a big step when compared to the past. First of all, it has determined a framework and established the rules for teleworking in Turkey. However, there are still shortcomings in terms of labor rights. Now I will highlight them on the next slides. When we talk about the TGS activities, I can say that after the pandemic broke out, TGS has called all employers in the sector to implement teleworking to protect media workers. Teleworking has successfully been started to set up in unionized companies. The call of the union on teleworking has encouraged journalists in many media outlets also. And teleworking continued until June 2021, in particular, many printed media. The union has also called for adequate occupational health and safety measures, especially for reporters who have to work in the field. In this context, a series of press statements made by the union since March 2020. In March 2020, the union also organized a web page to inform employees about their legal rights. Lawyers of the union prepared the most asked questions and their answers on the page. Now we are seeing our related web page. We also added an email link, directly access to lawyers on the page in case journalists need more information about their legal rights. And in March 2021, the union published a report covering the impacts of the pandemic and teleworking in the last year. About the report, from March 2020 until February 2021, the union interviewed, including face-to-face and online meetings, interviewed 1,206 journalists and media workers from 19 cities. Also, the union visited 22 different workplaces in total. Hence, the union has uncovered negative impacts of the pandemic and teleworking in the sector. Problems said by employers, one of them, a decline monthly income because of the short time working allowance in the sector, in the country, I mean. Many of them say that they were forced to work full-time by employers, despite being on a short-time working allowance. A decline in monthly income due to the unpaid leave, an increase in their workloads at work and home, especially said by women journalists, and lacking adequate tools and materials for teleworking, a rise in unpaid overtime during teleworking, and a decrease or cut the lunch voucher payment completely due to the teleworking. Then they say that inadequate occupational health and safety measures, both in workplaces and telework. Many of them, I mean, journalists and media workers say that they face more precarious working conditions in the sector after the pandemic broke out. After publishing this report, the union announced a teleworking guideline for the sector. The guideline includes 12 significant suggestions to the official institutions and employers in the media sector. The other point I would like to say, it is the first and only guideline manifested by a union in Turkey about teleworking. Suggestions in the guideline, one of them, we say that regulations on teleworking should be in line with ILO standards. Then teleworking should be organized on a voluntary basis. There should be no discrimination among workers employed remotely or in the workplace regarding promotion, training, economic and social benefits, and so on. Employers should guarantee decent and fair working conditions for remote workers, and employers should show respect collective rights of remote workers. Working hours and breaking times should clearly be determined within the limits of the law, labor law. Also, employers should respect the right to disconnect out of the working hours. In overtime working, remote workers should continue to receive payment in line with the Labor Act. Employers also should support adequate equipment required for teleworking. Also, we said that expenses related to teleworking, like electric, water, gas, mobile phone, or internet bills, and so on, should be included in the agreement contract. Employers also should continue to take responsibility for occupational health and safety measures for remote workers. Also, employers should respect the right to privacy for remote workers, and they should limit the activities of monitoring tools used by the business purposes. Last one, employers should inform adequately remote workers about cybersecurity and provide them with relevant software before starting teleworking. At 7 of the total unionized companies, teleworking is currently in progress. The union has provided decent wages and fair working conditions for remote workers in the signed collective agreements in harmony with the teleworking guideline. The union has used all activities, I mean legal support, publishing report, press statement, guideline, collective bargaining negotiations, used all of them as leverage to increase the number of unionized companies. And therefore, the TGS increased the number of unionized companies to 14 during this period. Within this strategy, the union has aimed to limit the negative impacts of the pandemic and teleworking in the Turkish media industry. I guess we can say we had success during this period. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation on how one union has dealt with this entire complex. I will open up the floor for questions for any of the three panelists if someone have questions burning inside them. Otherwise, I would also encourage you to share if you have any good practices from your country that the rest of us could learn something from. Don't be shy. As we heard in the presentation from Austria yesterday, one of the problems that we see in Austria, and I think in Denmark as well, is this social isolation, the insecurity that you can have when you don't have colleagues to mirror your work in and to banter with. In Denmark, we have also seen this in a very extreme degree in our student membership, the journalism students who all of a sudden were on remote learning, and they naturally, as just starting out on their careers, they have experienced a lot of insecurity, and when they don't have other students or teachers to talk to in person, they have really been hit hard by this pandemic. In association with the unions in other fields, we are currently trying to see what we can do for these students. Also so that the COVID generation won't for the next many years be a generation where employers are negatively affected by maybe the lack of education that has been the case for the past 18 months. I don't know if any of you others have that same problem.
Yes, in Belgium, we are facing the same problem for students. The depression rate jumped from 8 to 20% at my hometown university. And the issue is, I think, more complicated for students because both the social life and the student life is impacted, and at this age, social life is very central. Maybe more than for the working population, which may explain why depression rates are so high in this segment of the population.
Yes. Does anyone else have comments or experiences they want to share with us?
I have a question for our speaker, Naila. You mentioned that there been the outreach to workers within the company has been very low, almost half. And I just wonder, and you presented a lots of good practice from the website tools that you got. So I wonder if you have any good practice or good recommendations for unions and association to reach out to their members. You know, when telework becoming the new norm, is there any good practice?
Yeah, the tricky thing here is that we have to have the right to access the members using the professional tools. And this is something that we always asked when we sign an agreement with the employer, is to be able to use the professional tools to have to send emails, but also to have meetings like on Teams or Zoom or whatever with them on working time. It's not always easy to have it. I can say in my company where I work, I just sent emails, and even though they keep telling me we don't have the right to, so now they have to go to the court to stop me from doing this, and they don't go. So they know that it's not very easy for them to success if they go to the court, because we have to be able to reach our colleagues when we telework. So what I would say is go ahead and do it. The most difficult thing is to find the list of emails. But with Outlook, you can have, there are some tricky things you can do. So you can download the list and go ahead and do it, even if they don't accept to put it in agreement, because otherwise our function as trade unionists is not, we will not be able to do it. I mean, how can you be a representative of your colleagues if you cannot reach them? So I doubt that the employer will go to the court one day for this. So this is my advice, just do it.
If I may add something, in Germany, in the rubber industry, social partner conducted an agreement on the use of communication channels in company by trade unions. So this kind of agreement exists and should certainly be the standard at the European level, of course.
Yes, and one thing I would add also is at European level, we have this 2002 European Agreement on Telework, which is a bit old now. But what I can tell you is that we are starting the negotiation on the work program for 2022-2024. And the first topic on the agenda for the trade unions, for ETUC, but also for the employers, is telework. So most probably starting from January, we may start negotiating on telework. And in this case, of course, the new telework that we are experiencing today will be taken in consideration. And the first thing would be the trade unions' rights. So hopefully we can have a European agreement on this that can complete the old one. And also, I know that there are so many national agreements, but the thing is that we had these national agreements in this period of the pandemic, and it was very urgent to negotiate an agreement because everyone was in telework and many of them did not experience telework before, especially also for SMEs. So it was urgent, and sometimes trade unionists had to accept some conditions that are not very good. So it was negotiating in a rush, urgent agreements. So it was not always perfect agreements. So I think if we start negotiating in January, it would be a good period after this pandemic, and we can have a more balanced agreement.
Thank you. Elias, your presentation mentioned that a lot of your members in the survey felt that they were more precarious, the working conditions now. And we know across the media landscape in Europe, we have a lot of freelancers and solo employed. Do any of you have any good experiences in including freelancers or solo employed in the regulations regarding telework somewhere? I know it's a big question.
Problem is that for Turkey, freelance journalists are out of the legal protection, legal regulations. For example, a freelancer couldn't be join a union. So out of the protection umbrella of unions. But we know that our unionized companies employ some freelancers in the field. with our collective agreements say that equal rights should be implemented for freelancers and our members on the economic and social rights and benefits in particularly. But we have a big barrier in Turkey to protect freelancers in the field, unfortunately.
Thank you. I don't know, Pierre, you were talking about this might being a big shift in the way we organize work and the way we think about work in the years coming. Do you foresee that freelance work and distance work might combine so that more and more companies will try to hire more freelancers and limit the number of employees?
It's already the case with this shift was forced for many companies, but now that they believe they managed to organize remote work, that's opening new possibilities for them to cut the cost and hire a freelancer who are operating 100% telework. So it's already the case, but well, the issue is wider with platform work, with all these new forms of work where the workplace doesn't exist anymore, where the contract doesn't exist anymore. So everything is fragmented, and for trade unions, it's the biggest challenge for the years to come is to remain relevant and to access, to protect these workers and to reinvent the way we communicate with workers. So new channels, maybe making it easier to join a union online, and so yeah, we have so much work to stay relevant.
I agree, but I think the shift is coming, and finding the good solutions to this will be key to every union across the globe and in Europe in particular. I will give you a chance to come with another question now. Otherwise, I will send the word back to Yuklan. Yuklan?
No more questions? Last chance. Okay. So, well, I think maybe it's quite late and you have lunch, but thank you very much for the panelists for sharing with us some good ideas, and all three of you have very good recommendations, and I hope the participant will find it useful. Our members will find this useful, and especially very inspiring from our colleague from Turkey. Despite the political situations, you managed to get more workers, journalists in your union, and you managed to do more collective agreement. So that's very inspiring work that you've done. So I hope you all get some tools back and inspirations. And again, if you want, we will ask the presentation that's sharing today and yesterday. So I know some of you have been asking me, so I will share with you, and there will be a summary of today's discussions on this, and we will share the final report. So hopefully you will see all this useful recommendation and tools in the coming week with you. And if you have any more questions or any good practice, please feel free to contact me and the FJ colleagues, and we will be very happy to share with you and also to hear some of the good practice that you have and included in our report and final recommendations. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alan, and thank you for all of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Oh, thank you. Goodbye.